asistentes están en modo de solo escucha.
Hola, buenos días a todos. ¿Cómo están? Bienvenidos a otro webinar de internacionalización del área de posicionamiento global. Quiero, bueno, darles la bienvenida y como usualmente lo hago, hacer una breve prueba de sonido para asegurarme que todos están escuchando bien. Entonces, en el panel que ustedes tienen ahí hay un espacio para preguntas. Si quieren escribir brevemente si están escuchando para saber que todos escuchan bien. Perfecto. En este mismo espacio ustedes más adelante podrán ir escribiendo las preguntas para que nuestro conferencista Charles pues las pueda responder. Les recuerdo que este es un webinar que se llevará a cabo en inglés y pues las preguntas también, por favor, pues si pueden escribirlas en inglés será mejor. Bueno, sin mucho preámbulo, pues le voy a dar la bienvenida a Charles. Nosotros hemos tenido la oportunidad de trabajar con él en varias ocasiones. No sé quiénes estuvieron con nosotros el año pasado en los talleres de habilidades en mercado y ventas. Tuvimos más de 148 empresas asistentes en todo el país y pues hoy lo tenemos de nuevo con un webinar que nos pareció bastante interesante que es sobre forecasting revenue. Nos va a explicar diferentes técnicas sobre cómo hacer estas proyecciones de ingresos. Y para darles un breve perfil, Charles pues tiene más de 35 años en la industria de software. Él ha sido inversionista, director y funcionario en más de 2 empresas de tecnología. También se ha desempeñado como banquero de inversión e inversor de capital semilla a más de 100 empresas de tecnología. Digamos que es una persona bastante experimentada en el sector y bueno, tenemos la fortuna de contar con él hoy, entonces pues sin más preámbulos le voy a dar la bienvenida. Charles, thank you so much for being here with us and you can go ahead.
Great, thank you very much. This is an interesting topic for me, forecasting, because I spent 15 years running a company called Cynamics, and it took me 10 years to get really good at this issue of forecasting revenue. And the reason it became important to me was that we had revenue that was very lumpy. So we would get an order for $1 million or $2 million a number of times a year. And then we'd have some smaller revenue, but our revenue was up and down, and some months or quarters we'd have no revenue, and other months or quarters we'd have phenomenally good revenue. And so it became really important for me to be able to forecast revenue so that I knew how much I could spend and how much I couldn't spend. And so I started on this trying to figure out how to forecast revenue for a software company. And I played with my forecasting methods for maybe a year or 2 years until I finally had a method that I found actually worked. And so a lot of this and a lot of what I'm doing is built on what I did wrong and what my mistakes were in doing that. And I found that when I was able to forecast revenue, I could actually produce profits on a consistent basis. And before I was able to forecast revenue, my profits were very inconsistent. Sometimes I'd be profitable, sometimes I wouldn't be profitable. It didn't really work out. And then I sort of realized if you can forecast revenue, you're able to figure out, you're able to be profitable all the time because you know exactly how much you're going to spend. So to me, it became very, very important to be able to forecast revenue in order to be able to drive profits. So if you can imagine you're an airline company, and as an airline company, you take orders and you deliver your planes 3 years later. If you're delivering planes and delivering revenue 3 years after you get an order, you should be able to forecast your revenue almost exactly. And if you're in a business that has any length of a selling cycle, which most software businesses are that are selling to companies, you should be able to forecast revenue within a certain time frame and then be profitable. So that's why forecasting revenue becomes so important to people. A lot of companies I've worked with don't spend too much time on that, and so that they never get this right, and as a result, your profits are more of a mystery. So what I wanted to do for the first thing was to find out who here, and if you could just type in the chat line, who here is actually forecasting revenue and what sort of expectations you've got. It would be helpful to understand what people are doing right now. So take a second and just in the chat section, tell me whether you're forecasting revenue and what increases in revenue you're expecting, etc. I'm not seeing anybody chatting. Is it fair to say that people aren't forecasting revenue? Is that the issue? Well, since that didn't work, I'll go on. Not knowing your expectations, but maybe we can come back to those at another point in time, or maybe the application isn't working. I got a forecast from someone yesterday who's in the software business, and he's relatively new. He's doing about 800,000 Canadian dollars in revenue this year, so somewhere around $600,000 US in revenue. And the forecasts he presented to me were that he was going to do $4 million in revenue next year and $24 million the year after that. So I can consistently see forecasts from people who are in $1 million software companies that are looking like they're going to be doing $50 million revenue in the next year, and they've got 75% profit levels based on a $2 million investment. Now, those of you who have been in the business a lot longer than that know that getting results like that is almost impossible. There are a few American companies that can do that, but in general, that type of result is just not something that's achievable. And they create what then are what I call hockey stick forecasts. And I presume hockey is not a very big game in Colombia, but in Canada, that's our #1 game. And that is actually what a hockey stick looks like. If you've ever seen a hockey stick, it's got a very short end and a very long handle that goes up on a very steep angle. So hockey stick forecasts in Canada are something where a company is doing small increases in revenue, but their expected increase in revenue is absolutely enormous on an ongoing basis. The problem with hockey stick forecasts is that they are entirely impossible to achieve, and the biggest problem is that when you've got these types of hockey stick forecasts is that if you're forecasting to increase your revenue at a really incredible amount on an annual basis, then in all probability you're going to spend what you think you're going to be able to spend if you get your increased revenue. And so I've seen lots of companies that have forecast enormous increases in revenue, and they spend money thinking they're going to get there, but when they don't achieve their revenue forecasts, of course, what happens is they lose money and frequently go out of business. There was a company just in the papers in the last couple of days in Canada that that had raised $72 million over the space of 5 years, and over the next 6 years, they actually spent it all and went out of business. Now, they could probably still be a very successful company if they hadn't had such ridiculous revenue forecasts, because they're able to achieve levels of growth that are more modest, and when you're achieving more modest levels of growth, your spending is more modest, and you can keep your spending in line with your profits. So this is a problem, particularly in the U.S. industries, and for people who are wanting to enter the U.S. and to get venture capital forecasting, it becomes a very big problem because you're making promises to investors, and you've got to live by your promises, achieve your promises, and if you don't get further investment. So accurate forecasting becomes extremely important so that you don't spend too much, so that as a result you're profitable, and in meeting your forecasts you're able to raise money, and you can have predictable growth and not what many companies have, which is large swings upwards and downwards as they think revenue is going to be achieved and isn't achieved. So if you look at the reality of results and what companies are able to achieve, and I can sort of talk to the big companies as well as the small companies. If you look at it, typical forecasts, and I looked recently at 35 startup software companies, and the average first-year growth they were budgeting was over 400%, and the average second-year growth they were budgeting was about 200%. Now, what's really interesting is I found that most companies that aren't in the business of raising money don't actually do forecasts. And the ones that do forecasts do these forecasts that are absolutely enormous. So I've run into very few companies that actually have forecasts that are like 5 or 10% growth that are reasonable numbers for them to be able to achieve. Other companies that are able to, other companies that are targeting ridiculous amounts of 400, 246%, things that aren't actually achievable. So I've gone through and done studies of what companies are able to achieve, and most of these companies are in the right same size as Colombian software companies in terms of their results. If you look at the 100 top software companies in Canada, the smallest company in that group had sales of about $2 million. So if you look in the US, those numbers are completely irrelevant, but this really works much better in Canadian terms. Now, if you look at these are the most successful companies around. The average actual growth rate was 24%, and the biggest grew about 23%, the smallest growing at a rate of about 40%. So success in the software business, even the very biggest companies that I've found, typically don't grow as fast as people think they do. So even the most successful Canadian companies, software companies, are growing at somewhere around 25 to 35% a year and achieving really good results because of that. Now, what you realize if you start looking at 25% growth over 10 years, the numbers that you actually get up to are you become a phenomenally successful company if you can grow at 25%. So when I'm working with companies, I'm trying to typically say, if you try and grow at about 25% if you can do it. I also know that's about the level that it's possible to actually produce profits and have enough profits to be able to fuel that growth at about 25%. So when I look at really successful, so the very top of the top companies, and these are the ones that are venture capital forecast, Canadian companies are taking about 10 years to get to $10 million in annual revenue. But in the US, the successful companies are taking 6 years to reach $10 million. And in 10 years, they're getting to $50 million. One of the biggest reasons for that is the Americans have a much better understanding of marketing and what's required to be successful in a software company. And, I've talked about these statistics before when I've been down in Colombia, and I keep repeating them, is that successful software companies are spending twice as much on sales and marketing as they are on research and development. And in Canada, that number is more likely $1 of sales and marketing to $1 of research and development. In Colombia, what I've run into all sorts of companies that are actually spending very little on sales and marketing, spending most of their money on research and product development and operations and things like that. So if you want to be a company that is going to grow to phenomenal size, $10 million in 6 years or even 10 years, you're going to have to spend phenomenal amounts on sales and marketing to be able to get there. And there's a great study that's available that shows, and this study was done a couple of years ago, showing how long it took companies to reach $50 million in sales, which in the US is good sized terms. In Canada, we don't actually have that many companies that are above that. In fact, you can see in these, there are some that are above $200 million in sales. As I said, it was done a couple of years ago. In sales valuation as $1 So that's there might be, there are 150 U.S. companies that are private with over $1 billion. So this is a good representative set. Is that the really hyper ones that are able to within 5 years to $50 million. Lots of really successful companies that are taking 15 and 50. Now, you know, if we had more of those in Canada, that would be a marvelous thing. And I know the same situation exists. $50 million companies, it would be a phenomenal success. But achieve in terms of markets and in terms. So what I look at and what I study is rocket ships, and I'm trying to help companies become rocket ships. And a rocket ship, 50 million in annual sales in 6 years or less. And as I said, there aren't very many of those. Most successful technology companies aren't rocket ships, and only 28% of the U.S.'s most successful software companies were actually rocket ships. So this is really rare. A hot shot can reach 50 million in 7 to 12 years, but a slow burner takes 13 years or more. So when you're looking at your revenue and what you're trying to achieve, what you have to figure out is where you are now and where you want to go and what levels of growth that's going to have to require and how you're going to have to get there. So we're going to look at some of the methods of looking at that growth. And the first thing is, when you're doing forecasts, don't try to outdo what Google and Facebook did. Those are the best companies that have ever been produced. And unfortunately, I keep seeing new entrepreneurs starting up, trying to outdo and having forecasts that are much larger than Google was actually able to produce. And that is a significant problem if you're trying to grow, because no one will believe those types of forecasts, etc. So there are two ways of doing forecasts, and I'm going to go through those two ways today. And the first is what we're called top-down forecasts. And top-down forecasts are when you look at the market that you're in and what your position is in that marketplace to figure out both what's going to happen with the market and what's going to happen with you relative to that market. Top-down forecasts are useful to look at as a check against your bottom-up forecast, which is the second method. And we're going to go through both of those. The reason I started doing top-down forecasts was that in Cynamics, somewhere along the development, maybe 5 years in, I started looking at what the market size was for the area we were working in, and I got the market size entirely wrong. I think I overestimated bias, and I really struggled to figure out how big the market is, because you can read reports and estimates and things like that, but most of those reports and estimates about market size are really incorrect. That they're built on something that estimates more than just your portion of the market, but all sorts of ancillary and other services that are bundled in that are offered by other people. So when you're looking at reports by Gartner and Frost & Sullivan, and if you get those types of market research reports, they're not really talking about the market that you're in. They're talking about a general larger market. So in learning to do top-down forecasts, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out the size of the markets that I was operating in and how those markets were changing. And before you start, you've really got to know some critical things. You've got to understand who your target market is, what your business model is, and what your go-to market strategy is. And this is where we get into the issue of forecasting revenue as a marketing function and not a finance function. Forecasting revenue isn't something that you can leave to the accountants. It really is something that you have to give to the marketing and sales people, because they're the ones who have to understand that market, understand how they're getting to the market, and understanding where they belong in the market to be able to to bring those forecasts out into the marketplace more effectively. So if you understand who your target market is and your business model and go-to-market strategy, then it's possible to look at how big the market is. Now, as I mentioned, there are reports in Gartner and Frost and Sullivan that says, the market is $50 billion and we're going to get 1%. And almost all entrepreneurs try that analysis at some point in time. And I've tried it multiple times, and I'm in conversations with people all the time that are saying, this is a great $50 billion market. It should be easy for us to get 1 or 2%. In fact, one entrepreneur I talked to was thinking he should develop a new type of market, and that if he didn't get 7% of the market, it wasn't even worth going into business. So that type of analysis has no bearing on reality. So ignore the Gartner type forecasts if you're looking at market size, etc., and looking at what your potential is. What you've got to do is start from looking at the market you're serving and the target market that you're dealing with specifically. So the way to do that is you start with how many potential users there are. And so I picked here one particular sector of the U.S. economy to do an analysis on. And I presumed that somebody was selling into what are diagnostic and medical and diagnostic laboratories. Now, if you statistics on the number of medical and diagnostic laboratories, most people will find that there are 7,800 or close to 8,000 different companies in this business. And so if you're selling into that marketplace, you'll think, oh, this is no problem. There are 8,000 businesses that I can sell to. Therefore, I'm going to figure out I'm going to sell on average, to 25% of those. So I'm going to sell 2,000 to 2,000 firms. But when you look at it, if you're in the software world, most are not your target market. It's usually the mid-size, or if you're really successful, the larger companies that are your target market. So you have to understand the number of potential users in a market. And what is really interesting here is that if you look at the number of firms, there are a total of close to 8,000 firms, but 7,300 of those firms have less than 100 people, so they might not be part of your target market. You can even divide that number down further to get to firms below 25, etc. if you get more granular data. But I picked this data out of laboratories. There are about 319 companies that are between 100 and 499 people in size, and there are 500 or more that have, 206 people. Some of you're probably selling to the mid-sized buyer, so the 100 to 499. There are about 319 firms. If you happen to have the larger ones, you've got a bigger market in total. But what you should look at then is the number of establishments, because if you can sell to each branch of an office, then you actually want to sell to the larger size vendors, because that 265 large vendors have in total over 3,000 establishments. So they've got over 3,000 offices. And the ones that are the 319 that are between 100 and 499 in size actually have over 1,000 different offices. So when you look at it, if you're trying to sell a piece of software that works for an office, then if you're targeting the larger customers, you've got over 4,000 potential users for your technology. Now, I was having a conversation in the last week with someone who's selling to pharmacists, and he's trying to sell software system to pharmacists in Canada, and he went through this type of analysis, and he told me that there were something like 8,000 pharmacists in pharmacies in Canada. And then so I started breaking down the market for him, and what he realized is that 3,000 of those pharmacies that were part of the major chains, and those major chains would never be customers for 4,000 pharmacies that were single owner pharmacies, and because of the cost and complexity of the software, they were never going to become customers. So that his market was actually 1/8 of the total market, so about 1,000 potential pharmacies that potentially buy that what he had to sell. So getting statistics like that enables you to figure out, okay, I've got a certain number of users, and so this is my total potential. Now you have to say, okay, if you're selling something new or relatively new in the marketplace, what's the rate of adoption? And if you look at it, this is a typical rate of adoption curve for any marketplace, in that you get 2.5% of the market are innovators, 13.5% might be early adopters, 34% the early majority, 34% late majority, and 16% laggards. So if you're selling a brand new application, you're going to find that it takes a very long period of time until all the people in the marketplace have signed off and bought your new application. If you're selling something that's been in existence for a while, you actually might be better off because you might be selling to the early majority or late majority of buyers, in which case there's a much bigger marketplace, and all of the preparatory work is getting you into the marketplace. So knowing the rate of adoption and have the application enables you to figure out what the size of the market's going to be over a longer period of time. Because as you can imagine, if you're dealing with 7,800 medical and diagnostic laboratories, it's going to take some period of time before they've all bought. And so your market size changes on an annual basis. When you look at a market and its fully presented total market size, you get initially the innovators come into the market. The market starts to take off at a rapid pace, and there's a really rapid growth in that marketplace as the early majority and late majority come in, and then eventually the laggards, and over a period of time, eventually everybody is in and has purchased something in the market. So when you start with these types of things, you start with what your total market is going to be and how that market is going to change over a time period of a certain number of years. Therefore, what the total market size is going to be over time period, not specifically in the first year. The next thing you have to figure out is what your market share is. And your market share is an interesting enough time trying to figure out actually the dynamics of the market a number of years ago. And this is an older slide because Google only has 68%. Yahoo actually still had 20% of the search market at the time. And there were others in the marketplace like Bing from Microsoft, etc. That's changed over time because Google was so successful. But most markets, in most of them, the leader in the marketplace might get about 40%. And they might have about, the second follower might have 25 to 30%. And from there it goes down quite rapidly in market share. So knowing where you exist in your market and what sort of market share you're going to get means you have to understand your target market. So if you're looking at the mid-sized medical and diagnostic laboratories, of which there are about 300 or about 1,100 different establishments there, you might say that you have the best software for that market, and over time you're going to be able to get about, let's say, 40% of that market because you're the best in that market. So over time you're going to sell to about 120 different medical and diagnostic laboratories, or with that maybe about 400 different establishments. So now what you can do is you can say, let's look at the total market and what's going to happen over a number of years to produce these top-down revenue forecasts. So the first thing you've got to know is I picked here in that 5,779 the total number of establishments for mid-size and large-size medical and diagnostic laboratories. And I presume that your revenue per year that you're selling a service and software together, which is operating their whole back end, etc., was going to be about $250,000 a year. But it would take 20 years for the full diffusion of that marketplace to take place. So over 20 years, everybody will have, in that marketplace will have come to purchase this type of software. Now that's an interesting number to get to because most people don't realize how long it actually takes to get full diffusion of an idea into a marketplace. I generally say that it takes about 30 years before everybody in a marketplace is in and is using something fully. And that number changes, and some markets are faster to take up applications than others. In some cases, you never ever get to the end of the marketplace. I was dealing with a company that asset maintenance software for mines. And what they found is that there's a certain type of mine that will just never buy their software because they will never be large enough to warrant asset maintenance software. They're fine using Excel. This is the problem with your penetration of the marketplace, is that it's going to take a long time to get there, and even then you might not get to full penetration. But in this analysis, I presumed, let's say it takes 20 years because we're dealing with mid to large companies, and we're able to get full penetration of that marketplace. And I presumed in this case that our market share was going to be 18%, which is the fourth number down on that list. So then I said, okay, if I follow that curve of market penetration from 2 slides before, it's going to take me about 10 years to get to 50% of the marketplace. So that 50% of the marketplace will have bought something. So I applied a set of numbers that said we're going to go from 0.1% and we're going to grow through penetration to 50% in 10 years. Now, from then on, it's simple math, because your market size is simply your penetration rate times the number of establishments times the revenue per year per establishment, which gets the market in the first year about $1.4 million, growing to a market that is fully diffused at about $722,000 revenue in 10 years. Your total revenue then potential in 10 years is about $130 million. Now, if you look at these numbers, this is really typical of a really high growth software company. And I didn't even engineer this to make it look like that. But when you look at the revenue for the company, which is the third column, year 1 of 260,000, year 2 of 650, 1,000,003 in the third year, and growing consistently at about 50% a year, and then slowing down in years 9 and 10. This is actually what happens to software companies, the very best software companies. Those are the best numbers that people can achieve in the software industry, for the most part, in the United States. So it's actually fairly a good representation of how a market evolves for somebody who's got about 18%, which is a fairly good leading position in a marketplace. So in looking further at these, you've got to build a model for yourself that takes your industry and looks at your industry in this way. And if you don't have annual revenue per year of 250,000, if you're selling something that's a capital purchase, you've got to change that model to reflect how many people are buying and then what they're buying in software support. I did this simply for somebody who is selling on a recurring revenue basis, but it's still possible you can tweak it to do something that's non-recurring revenue. So in order to do this, you really got to understand what your metrics are and how your metrics work and how your business model works. You've got to understand the inputs and outputs of your business to understand the relationship between items and to understand what you do and what results you get in order to proceed further. Because we started with the market, a top-down forecast. We're now going to move in a second to a bottom-up forecast. But to understand how your bottom-up forecast works, you really have to understand this business model and how your business model works for inputs and outputs. For instance, you have to know that if you make 20 sales calls or 20 phone calls, you're going to get 5 visits, and those 5 visits will lead to 2 proposals, and one of those proposals will lead to a sale. And that's, so your input is your 20 sales calls, your output is your 1 sale from those 20 sales calls. And that is the business model of inputs and outputs. You can also, from that, figure out what your outcomes are, the financial and operational outcomes. For instance, that 20 phone calls that results in 1 sale has financial and operational outcomes, so that 1 sale, let's say, is worth $250,000, and you know the cost to program that, or the cost for hardware is a certain amount. So you can then take your outcomes and figure those out effectively in order to figure out what your top line and bottom line revenue is going to be, and add in such things as to your forecast what your marketing costs are and your sales people required in order to achieve the results you need. So knowing your business model that says 20 calls makes one sale, you know then that if a person can do 20 calls in a month, then because they have to research and do things like that, and it takes 6 months to get somebody, you know what marketing costs are required and the number of salespeople that are required just by understanding your metrics. So I've spent more time in the past on metrics in your marketplace, but metrics are really critical to understand, understanding the dynamics of your business and the causality between items, knowing exactly what action causes what result, enables you to do the next thing, which are bottom-up forecasts. So bottom-up forecasts are what I really got good at Synamics. I eventually got good at top-down and understanding the markets I was serving. When I actually got good at the top-down forecast, I started underestimating the number of potential customers, and that was what led me to success, because any reports that I was getting overestimated them. So I started underestimating, and it started working. But my real success was understanding the bottom-up forecast. And in order to do these, I actually changed my methodology for running the business. And I produced bottom-up forecasts actually on virtually on a weekly basis. Now, most people start bottom-up forecasts with what is called the revenue plug. And I see these in forecasts all the time. They decide that the first month is going to be $100,000, and so they put $100,000 or $10,000 in the first month, $20,000 in the second month, and they build a forecast that has no understanding of the metrics behind it, or understanding of what actions cause what results, and therefore what those results mean in terms of revenue. So the revenue plug as forecast is what 90% of people use, but it's actually the wrong methodology and results in something that has no bearing and no relation to reality. So what you have to know in order to do bottom-up forecasts is to understand your sales funnel. And I think I've touched on this several times in webinars and in workshops that I've done in Colombia, is that understanding your sales funnel is absolutely critical to doing well-meaning revenue forecasts. And this is why revenue forecasting is more of a marketing function than a financial function. So you've got to understand how things move from leads to discussions to proposals to evaluation to trial to order to install. Now you probably already know that mentally, but if you could go back and look at what it took for each of your sales and understand how long each of those sales took, the actions that you had to take, you start to build a model for your sales funnel that enables you to capture information that you can then use for forecasting. So the first thing you've got to understand is how you're going to get leads. How are you going to find out who the potential buyers for your software are, and how you're going to uncover them as potential. A number of the companies I talked to last year said all they do is they wait for leads to come in. People phone them because their networks say that they can do things, they can't do things, etc., so that they wait for the customers to come in the door. That's not the most effective way to get leads. The more effective way would be, if you're selling corporate software, to actually pick up the phone and call people, to engage in social media, to do produce marketing content, a whole variety of ways to get leads. But understanding how you're going to get leads is the first step in the process, because you might need 100 leads in order to get 2 potential sales. And so we're going to work through the system of what goes on and what takes a lead down to a sale. So the first thing you have to know is, from the time that you get a lead, how long does it actually take to land that lead and to take that lead and make them into a customer? So when you start this process with a lead, typically it might take a month for a discussion, and then maybe if you're lucky, you get them asking for a proposal, and that's another month of activity back and forth with a proposal. They might take 2 months to evaluate what you're doing and to look at potential competitors, etc. They might want to do a trial of your software or test drive it for a period of 2 months, and then actually getting the order out from somebody might take a month, and delivery of that might take 2 months. So the total time between the lead, when you start, and getting your revenue might be 9 months. Now, my experience was that my customers, it typically took 18 months to get a sale in software, and this is why I got particularly good at forecasting revenue, is that I could tell from the stage of development that the customer was in how long it was going to take them to get to an order if they did order. And over time, that number became mostly predictable. Every now and then you get something that we call a bluebird, that all of a sudden somebody phones you and says, I need something, and 3 months later you've got a sale. But those were a real rarity. Most of the time it took about 18 months to go from a lead to a sale. The reason for that is that typically it took two fiscal years for a company to make a decision to buy something and to have that thing purchased. In the first year, they're going to do some research to find out how much they need to put in their budget. And because they didn't have a budget to start with, they need to put it in their budget, and then the second year they have the budget and are able to spend that budget so that it can take over a fiscal year. If you're lucky, you meet someone just as they're starting to do next year's budget, and that accelerates the sale depending on when you meet them, but you can't rely on that, so it doesn't work. So if you can go back and look at how long each of your sales took from beginning to end, it's a good understanding of the stage of development for this. Then another thing that you can do is figure out what your conversion rate is at each stage. So understanding that it's going to take you 100 clients to get 2 in the end if you're actually calling clients. It's a bit easier if you're waiting for them to call you because they're pretty serious by the time they call you. But even then, there are a certain percentage that don't end up buying. And as you go through each of the stages, knowing how long it takes, you can actually say how many go from one stage to another, so what your conversion rate is per stage. So let's say, only 50% of the ones that get to that are leads become a discussion, and 20% of those become a proposal, and 10% of those become an evaluation. So overall, your total number that you sell to would be about 2 to 4%, or 3% in this example, of the number of leads you get. So the whole process is understanding the flow of a customer and what percentage move from stage to stage enables you to create a forecast that is reasonable. Because you can say, okay, in each of these years we have a marketing effort, and we're going to identify in year 1 156 leads, in year 2 we're going to identify 366, in year 3 we're going to identify 510 leads. And the number of months it takes for each of these was the months from before of nine total months. The conversion rate of those, we're going to have the conversion rate from the last slide, and therefore the number that actually get ordered and delivered is a much smaller number. And so we have, as our previous forecast, a price of $250,000 a year. But in terms of the number of that are going on in year 2, you can actually do this on a monthly cash flow basis and produce something that flows month by month, showing the number of leads, etc. And I've just summarized it on this slide. You know what numbers that you need to get and what percentage actually order, and you come down to what your revenue is on the total revenue for any given year. If you're really accurate, you're doing this on a monthly basis, and your revenue is flowing in monthly and your costs are flowing out monthly in a very unique model. And I have a copy of a sample model that I can send Juliana at the end of this presentation for anybody who's looking at it that has these details in it. So what you need to do also is you've got to understand some rules of thumb and the marketing costs and the sales people that are required for success in the software business. Those rules of thumb are a good place to start, but you can identify those from the general software industry and then learn what they are for you on an ongoing basis. And some of the rules of thumb that I use are that sales and marketing in total cost about 40% of revenue. Somewhere between 25% and 40% of revenue is good for sales and marketing. And of that, if you save marketing and sales is about 40%, typically I see about 25% is cost of salespeople, and about 15% is marketing costs and content marketing and trade shows and advertising and things like that. There's another set of numbers you can deal with, which is this number of salespeople that are required. And depending upon the size of the sale, you can figure out what a good salesperson can do in a given year. And in the very best companies, a salesperson, because they've got a lot of marketing support and technical support, can do about $4 million worth of sales. In smaller companies, that number is about $600,000 to $1 million. And it really doesn't depend on the size of the transaction, because for some reason it depends on dollar size. So if you've got $100,000 transactions, a salesperson should be able to do about one a month, based upon having about 100 leads developed for them a quarter, and they fall out very quickly. A salesperson can manage about a bucket of 100 leads and manage that on an ongoing basis, and that should result, let's say, in a $100,000 sale, which is results in about $1 million or $1.2 million in revenue a year. You've got to understand those rules of thumb for the market as a whole, or the market you serve, and the business you're in, to be able to take those forecasts even farther. Then what you do is, once you've got your top-down forecasts and your bottom-up forecasts, and this is a very, very quick way of showing you how to do it, is you compare your top-down approach with your bottom-up approach. And you look at and say, okay, what are we learning from doing our top-down approach about the potential size of the market, how many leads we might be able to get, and how many salespeople we need based upon the number of leads that's possible to get in that marketplace. Because understanding that enables you to figure out what staffing you actually need in order to get the revenue that you're hoping. Then you work down your bottom-up approach to figure out what sort of direct results should be created by those salespeople and what cost you're going to need to support that. So the bottom-up and top-down aren't sitting on their own. They can't exist independently. You actually need to do both of them together in order to have a good forecast. And I was always better at the the bottom-up forecast than I was at the top-down forecast. Even over a space of 5 years, I never got particularly good at the top-down, because I was always being surprised by people I didn't realize were in the marketplace. But it was a good check on what I was doing in the bottom-up forecast. Some things you have to watch out for. You have to watch out for overheating the market. So, and that usually isn't the problem in Canada and Colombia, because we usually don't spend enough on sales and marketing. In the US, that's a very particular problem, because they have so much venture capital. They end up putting way too much into sales and marketing long before the market is ready to buy what they've got to sell. And when it comes around, they don't have enough money left to be able to get to the market. But at the same time, good companies start selling long before the product is ready. In the US, they spend as much on sales and marketing before the product is launched on a particular product as they do on the research and development of that product. And they use that approach to find out exactly what the market needs in terms of a product, and what they can do to make that product successful. And that's why that type of spending is required. So what's next in terms of what you have to do is that as you go through this process, you need to check your assumptions and revise them whenever you get new information. And I started the process of redoing my forecasts every single month. And I don't know many companies that do that, but they're small. Very large companies do their forecasts all the time. They're constantly forecasting based on the information that they're getting. So I found that at least on a monthly basis, I could get new information about new leads that have been uncovered, new stages of development for particular clients. Even if it was taking 18 months, I could find and move clients along the funnel and understand where they were, And based upon where they were and what changes were occurring in a month, I could change my forecasts on a regular basis to be able to know what I could spend money on and what I couldn't spend money on. And this is where it became very, very useful, because as I did my monthly forecast, I would hold a certain amount of my expenses in reserve and not start projects unless I saw the forecasts were turning dramatically positive, in which case I would release funding to undertake projects that I hadn't previously agreed to. And then if there were times when it looked like the revenue was going to decline, I would hold off on launching new projects. I would hold off on adding new people, etc. And through this process of checking monthly forecasts, I was able to get to a situation where for 10 straight years, I didn't have a single layoff required. And we had lumpy sales on a monthly and quarterly and semi-annual basis. But what I was able to achieve was consistent annual growth and consistent annual profitability. And I think it was really due to checking these forecasts monthly and understanding the dynamics of the marketplace and what it meant to the company. So in terms of investors, knowing if you're looking to get investors, it's really important to understand this particularly well, because knowing your forecast shows you know your business model, as well as knowing how you're going to get to the marketplace as a whole, knowing how your go-to-market strategy works. And you're going to understand this in a great enough detail to enable your investor to know that you really understand your marketplace and understand the dynamics of your business. But whatever you do, most investors will not believe your forecasts, unless, of course, you're forecasting 10 or 20% growth. But even then, I found that most investors discount any forecast dramatically because they're used to entrepreneurs being wildly optimistic. But you have a chance, if you've done a very good job with your top-down and bottom-up forecasts, of convincing investors of the possibility of achieving them, because you understand the dynamics of the marketplace, because you've done a good job of preparing them. So when you look at it, forecasting isn't a science, it's really an art, and it's an art of understanding your market, which is why at the very beginning I said that forecasting is all about marketing. It's understanding who your target market is, understanding how your target market behaves in making their purchases, understanding that the market share you're going to get and your relationship to your customers, so that you can understand the dynamics of your marketplace, and then the dynamics of your sales process that builds into achieving that market penetration. So, in actual fact, forecasting is all about marketing, and it's understanding the marketing and understanding the sales process and understanding your customers to be successful. Now, that's a very quick way of looking at sales and marketing. It's possible to do that in a workshop and to take everybody through their forecast, but we only had about an hour today to do that. What I will provide Juliana with is a sample of how I do it, so that you can look at a top-down forecast, and it looks at the same type of things you were looking at here, but just in more detail so that you can follow it. If now you've got any questions, we're coming up to about an hour and thought that we could open up questions if anybody's got them. And if not, you can always email me at cplant@materialminds.com. You can find me on Twitter to ask questions, which is @cplant, or you can link in, and I welcome anybody to link in with me, and they can find me on LinkedIn as Charles Plant. So why don't I open it up to see if anybody's got any questions? I'm not seeing any questions, so let me just ask if this is working. Anyone? Well, we've still got 21 people active, but no questions. Can anybody respond? Or maybe chat isn't working here. Is there anyone from Fedisoft there that can make sure that chat is working and we're able to get messages? I'm not able to see that anybody's able to see chat. Okay, so it's working obviously because I got something from Fedisoft. Just waiting to see if anybody's got a question about this material. I'll give it a minute or so. Oh, I'm seeing a different format for questions. Oh, hold on. Okay, now I'm seeing a different panel. I was using the chat panel. You've got questions in here. So I got a question from Grace Alvarez about these projections for 10 years, taking into account the slowdown in the region without being so optimistic or pessimistic. When I should have said, when I do a forecast, I really do 1 year forecasts and maybe 3-year forecasts. I do the analysis based on 10 years, but when I do the bottom up forecast, I never do something that's as long as 10 years because that's too long a period of time. It's also good idea, and I can get this from this question, to produce forecasts that are optimistic and pessimistic. So you might do 3 ranges of forecasts and check out different values of them. As I did it, I probably didn't do 3 different forecasts because I did the forecast so often that they were always producing different answers. So sometimes they were optimistic and sometimes pessimistic. Another question here is, where can we find data or info for Colombia and for the United States? I have a source that I will include in the file for data that you can get on the United States size of market. I don't know where you can get that market data for Colombia. If you have the Ministry of Industry or something like that that is producing statistics, a Bureau of Statistics, you might be able to get data for particular industries. In Canada, I can use Statistics Canada and it costs money. In the US, it is very, very easy to get data on industries. The US does a tremendous job of providing that with web access on a free basis. Canada, it's harder, and I don't know in Colombia. One thing you can do if you're selling into a particular market segment is actually go to the industry association for that market segment, and they often have information on a particular market segment within an industry. Another question, be rigorous in these stages to get a lead. It works for any medium, for example, social networks. Yeah, getting a lead is really, really critical to success. In terms of sending the presentation, yes, Grace asked that question, and Juliana has access to this and can send it out to you, and I'll send the other copy as well. Somebody said it's clear it's not a simple process, and many of the questions result with the work. That is actually correct. As you try it, you'll have questions, and feel free to ask me. Send me an email with a question, and that's the best way of getting, as you're working through this. Another question on the best marketing lead generation, the one that works best for me. I find that in terms of software, the best thing is to actually know the name of the person and the location of the person that you have to sell to. So it takes a lot of research to find that out. LinkedIn is particularly good at that. And you have to use a rifle and not a shotgun to find these things out, meaning that you have to aim specifically at an individual, unless you're dealing with consumer marketing. To deal with an individual in B2B, going and doing research on Zoom info, on LinkedIn, etc., to find the name of that lead, and then communicating with them through email and by phone calls to actually get a lead. And that's the only way that I've seen it work successfully in the long run. I know a company that's doing that locally, a person who has 4 people, and all they do is lead generation. They spend an awful lot of time on that, and that's been one of the reasons for their best success. In terms about do I know about the Canadian financial market? I do know a fair bit. It's a fairly large market, but there's that. If you want to send me an email about the Canadian financial market, I can explain the structure, etc., and the players. Please feel free to do that. As to these projections, 10 years taking into account slow down the region, I think that's a repeat question from Grace. Oh, my email. Okay, my email address is, I'll just type it here. And my Twitter, which is another way to get me, is that way. So is there an estimation of the percentage of how much a company has to invest in sales according with its revenue? Yes, I think that you've got to spend 25 to 40% of your revenue on sales. And the reason it becomes difficult is that many companies are in order to get sales, are reducing their price in order to compete with the larger vendors. And when you reduce your price, you're cutting into your margin and you can't afford sales and marketing costs. And as a result, it's a very big problem because you'll never have enough to sell adequately. What I'm hoping to do this year in Columbia is to go through a workshop on formulating a strategy for a software company so that you compete not based on cost, but based on other factors like quality or speed of service or something like that. And when you do that, you can then charge enough that enables you to spend enough on sales and marketing, 25 to 40%, and with that you can have a successful formula for growth. Somebody's comment, Grace again, be rigorous in these stages to get a lead. Yes, absolutely. Getting leads is the biggest part of success, because if you've got something that works for your marketplace and you find good leads, you'll be successful. Same question on getting leads. That's one. I think the way to understand the market, to know the market share, to build a metric for your business. Yeah. Yeah, I think I've answered the question of what percentage a company has to invest to get it, and repeat the email to, okay, good. I think I've taken care of all of the questions in that list. Are there any more there? If you have more questions, feel free to reach out and contact me. I love learning about what people are doing and how they're doing it. And if I don't answer for a little while, it's because I'm heading to Europe on Sunday, so I'll be gone for 2 weeks. So if you get me questions before Sunday, I'll probably get back to you, but otherwise I won't be able to get back to you because I'm hiking in Europe. So I think that's it. If there are no more questions, I'll say, oh, another question here. Excuse me, I did not find where to write. What's the most what's the most critical point when making a forecast? I think the most critical point is understanding your market and how your market behaves, and understanding how what you can do will change how your market behaves. So understanding your buyer and your target market, the process they go through to reach a decision is the most critical point in making forecasts, which is another reason I say it's a marketing exercise and not a financial exercise. Okay, I think that's great and that's enough. Thank you all very much for listening here. I'm sure it's probably very boring sitting and listening, but I've enjoyed it doing this. I wish I had a chance to communicate more, but perhaps we'll do this when I'm in Colombia this year. So thank you very much, and we'll call an end to that, and I hope you all have an excellent day.